Hello, the internet. Welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I am Anthony, your host. I hope you found our roundtable discussions on paleogenetics to be stimulating and informative. It was in a different format. I took a month out of our regularly scheduled programming to include those two episodes that were organized by Tina and Tim. And now we are returning to the format to which you are accustomed. In fact, in this episode, we are going to veer about as far away from paleogenetics and laboratory work as it's possible to get. Specifically, I often find myself wondering about the qualities of Byzantine, East Roman civilization, that make it more or less amenable to use for science fiction and fantasy. And there's some respects in which it's not a very hospitable culture in which to think in those genres. Specifically, it doesn't really have much of a mythology of its own. You don't really want to count, Christological doctrine or the celestial hierarchies as kind of narrative mythologies in which you can embed stories. At the same time, it's a very bureaucratic civilization, lots of paperwork, lots of accounting, and generally lots of central control by the imperial government. This also generally prevents the kind of decentralized feudal setting that most fantasy stories have. Now, having said that, many of you will know the quasi-vernacular Greek poem, the Genisakritis, which dispenses precisely with all of the institutional framework of East Roman life in order to present a kind of the heroic exploits of its protagonist on the eastern frontier, where he fights lions and so forth. So it can be done. Hasn't been done that much so far in modern fiction. Arguably, this civilization is more suitable for science fiction, perhaps, in being the model of a kind of large bureaucratic empire which you can project outward on a sort of galactic scale. And there are some authors who have done that, and we'll be talking about them. But there's another problem that's been nagging at me every time I think about these issues, and in relation to modern fiction in particular, which is that even the academic construct of, quote, Byzantium is itself already so fictionalized. It's so set outside of history, the whole association of ideas of, this kind of decadent, luxurious civilization in the East with eunuchs and intrigue and theology and obsession with monks and saints and miracles and demons and so forth. That's already a fictional setting. In my view, at least, it has little to do with the historical society once you study it, outside of the source, the few select sources that give you those kinds of images. Of course, a great deal of modern scholarship has focused precisely on those sources in order to construct that image. And so even the historical, quote, Byzantium is already a fictional setting in many respects, and especially in the early 20th century and starting already at the end of the 19th, the two worlds had kind of blurred together. In my view, at least, the kind of quasi-historical, romantic Orientalist visions of Byzantium that we find in late 19th century plays, such as the one by Sardou, Theodora, which we already discussed in episode 5 already with Elena Beck. Those were not altogether different from the Orientalist picture of Byzantium that was being promoted by scholars at that time. The two, I think, were fairly close together. So, if you don't think there's enough fantasy fiction about Byzantium, you can go read some early 20th century scholarship on it. But I digress, or perhaps I'm exaggerating. That's not what we're going to be talking about today. We will be talking about actual fantasy, horror, science fiction books that are either set in Byzantium or have a kind of Byzantine ambiance to them. My guest today is Przemysław Marciniak, who is a professor at the University of Silesia in Poland, and he has written extensively about the modern reception of Byzantium in literature and plays and other media. And I had been looking for an opportunity to bring him onto the podcast because I find all this material very interesting. When I came across a chapter that he published in a volume on Byzantium and popular imagination, which was on speculative fiction, a term that we can use to encompass some science fiction and fantasy and social critique and all kinds of other genres. And I thought that this was wonderful. I've read some of those books that he mentioned, not all of them. But this makes for an interesting conversation. And I would encourage you to stay until the very end when Przemek kind of turns the tables and puts me in the hot seat, asking me some questions about the implications of all of this for our concept of Byzantium, our understanding of it, and where how we understand the relationship between academic practice and popular perceptions of what we study, and whether those can be reconciled or whether they will pull apart in the years to come, and how, anyway, what my position is on this. So it's not often that the guest does that, so I appreciate that. So look out for that. Thanks again to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes, and let's get straight to the discussion. Przemek, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, it's nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So we are recording on May 29th. And now I have to say, so my editor at Oxford has been pressuring me for some time to write a new narrative history of the fall of Constantinople. I resisted for a long time, but finally I've caved. Anyway, so I'm collating all of the sources to try to reconstruct a day-by-day kind of diary of what happened during the 53 days. And today, this morning, I reached day May 29th, and it is May 29th today. Okay, we're already getting distracted. Yeah, we're diverting away from what we're here to talk about. So you've done a lot of work on Byzantium in fiction and popular culture generally, and edited a number of volumes, which I have devoured. And I finally found a paper that you wrote in a recent volume on Byzantium and popular imagination, which I thought this is fascinating because I have some items that I'd like to talk about, and you seem like the perfect interlocutor for this. So this is a paper on Byzantium in sort of science fiction and fantasy. And so let me start with this more general question. What periods or specific aspects or events in Byzantine history tend to draw the lion's share of attention in these genres of popular fiction? So what makes that civilization most attractive?
Before we start, can I say one thing? Because I think that it would be fair to say that the material that we're going to discuss, I assume, would be mostly English or the Western European and say some Polish. So to give this really justice, one would go across various languages and cultures, and this is not a one-man's job.
Sure.
I mean, so this is just a fraction of what we have. And I'm sure that there's lots and lots of texts that I have never, ever heard before. But okay, so go back to your question. Well, I think that this is not only sci-fi or speculative fiction, but it's more generally books like historical fiction and so on. There are two periods, 6th century, so Justinian and Theodora, and the fall of Constantinople, of course. I was wondering myself for a long time why, and I think that one of the answers is because this is what we are taught at schools. Because you have Justinian and Theodora, and then, of course, you have the fall of Constantinople, which I have no idea how it functions in the US, but in Poland, it marks the end of Middle Ages. Right. So it's already this black legend, right? So you have Dark Ages. The end of Dark Ages is the fall of Constantinople. There is some 19th century completely forgotten today play, and the guy has notes. The play is about the fall of Constantinople. And the guy has notes. I mean, the author has notes about the play. And at some point he says, the taking of Constantinople is too well known to need a comment. So it's not only our thing. It has always been this popular, I think. Yeah. And then Justinian and Theodora, I can't say for sure, but I sort of think that Victorien Sardou's Theodora also plays some role here, because we completely forgot that. But actually, it was insanely popular.
Yeah.
It's not, I mean, now these are Byzantinists who work on this play. But before, there were actually, it was super popular. So I think that all those facts combined, school, perhaps Theodora Sadus, and then the fact that it somehow it exists in the bigger historical narrative.
But Justinian and Theodora, we really mean like Procopius, right? Like he serves that period up on a plate with the wars, a sort of gripping military narrative, exciting, but also the secret history with all of the scandal and intrigue and background and sex. And it's just irresistible. Anyway, I just want
probably.
Yeah. So what kinds of actions or scenes or props or characters signal to an audience that we are now in a Byzantine setting? And I'm referring not so much to books that are sort of explicitly set in Byzantium, but those that are kind of aiming for a kind of quasi-Byzantine ambiance or atmosphere. And so what sorts of things do they use to signal that we're in that kind of setting?
That depends on, well, when you speak about architecture, that would be Hagia Sophia, right? And the Hippodrome. And this is mostly because you can go and see, you can still relate to this. Then, of course, you have this less tangible, so to speak, layer. So that would be monks, icons. I sometimes ask my students what kinds of associations do they have with Byzantium? And if they have any, it's icons. Icons and religion. Yeah. Everything was religious. I mean, I always tell them that this is a false view, because I understand if you go to Greece, you can mostly see churches, but Byzantium is not about churches and religion, at least not only.
Yeah.
So if you want something more sensational, then the eunuchs, of course, right? And then, of course, there's this, and we can't really get rid of this idea of intrigues, of murder, of this exotic. I mean, whatever we say, and I know that scholars have different opinions about whether Byzantinism is Orientalism or not, doesn't really matter. But this is how it is for many people. Yeah, Byzantium is something Oriental. And you can see this in those texts as well. When being in Byzantium means this is an Oriental place. This is like something not Western enough.
Right.
And I would say that this one, I could see this in many of those texts. Food is Oriental, this is Oriental, blah, blah, blah. And you have everything is Oriental, whatever this means. Because, I mean, of course, this is quite superficial to be, but these are not scholarly books. These are not
of course.
texts, right? They don't operate on this level.
So we've set the stage. What kind of plots or stories tend to be typical of this setting? So when fiction writers are kind of gesturing toward a quasi-Byzantine setting, what are the kinds of stories that tend to cluster around it?
The question is whether you can really list this, but as I said, eunuchs would be probably very popular. There's a book which is not actually like this is not really a fantasy book, but it's interesting nonetheless. It's called Memoirs of a Byzantine Eunuch.
Yes, I've read it.
Yeah, scandalous.
Yes.
Then I would say that it's a bit like, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, you already talked about you had a podcast about the Byzantium heavy metal.
Yes.
So, of course, Varangians. And even in Poland,
Right.
I mean, Varangians and all this stuff. And these are very popular. I mean, recently there were at least 3 books, I think, published in Poland where you have the Varangians, those stories, Scandinavians, right, in Constantinople. Once again, because I think that people can relate somehow to this.
Right.
And what else? Yeah, the narrative of the fall of Constantinople. It's that happens a lot. Well, it's difficult to say because one book it varies from one book to another, to be honest.
It's interesting you should mention the memoirs of Memoirs of a Byzantine Eunuch. I think it was written by someone called Harris, and he was very active in like gay liberation movements and so forth. or gay rights. And I think the eunuch in Byzantium story archetype sort of enabled him to talk about alternative sexualities and sort of more fluid sexualities. And you're right, that is a kind of genre that I've seen. There's another one by Jenkins called Raptor, which is actually it's not entirely Byzantine. So this is a companion of Theodoric the Great, so late 5th, 6th, early 6th century, who is kind of a hermaphrodite, to use a classical term, and kind of spends the novel alternating between being male and female, depending on the circumstances, from Constantinople to Ravenna, ultimately. So yeah, there are some of those. And the Varangians are a real subcategory with a lot of books in them. This is the Scandinavian warrior who sets out from the north and goes to Constantinople and has adventures on the way. Yeah, there's a lot of that. So if we turn to the more supernatural side of things, what kind of supernatural elements tend to appear in fiction about Byzantium?
It's an interesting question, because if you look at Byzantium from our perspective, it was as a supernatural world, yeah? So you have demons on the loose, miracles, well, everything you wanted. And actually, when I was researching the topic and I typed in, what was it? Werewolf in Byzantium. And then I got really a list of, cellulose on werewolves. And I thought, okay, fine. It's not actually what I'm looking for, but it's interesting anyway. Perhaps not my favorite, but the first vampiress. I recently discovered that you can say vampiress, not a female vampire, was Olivia Atta. So she was an ancient vampire. I think that the book is called The Flame in Byzantium or something like this. So she comes from Rome to Constantinople, of course, 6th century. What else? But, and I'm not sure that this is very popular, Anne Rice. So, the most well-known vampire storyteller, had a book called Blood and Gold. And this is partly set in Constantinople. And this is very interesting because she checks all the boxes. It's Oriental. She says it's Oriental.
Yes.
Everything Oriental. And this is quite amazing because she's quite detailed in her descriptions, which doesn't really happen very often when she describes Constantinople. But then, I'm not an art historian, and I have no idea what kind of mosaics were in Hagia Sophia in the 6th century. But apparently, the main hero the protagonist can go there and see Justinian and Theodora's mosaics. I don't think this was the case, but I have no idea.
No.
I don't think so. But all the boxes, right? Justinian, Theodora, mosaics, Oriental. Perhaps as a book, it's not that good. Well, I didn't like it so much, but I was absolutely fascinated. How can you shoehorn all those stereotypes about Byzantium in this narrative? And this was absolutely fascinating. There is actually a Polish novel, which is called Half of the Night, I think. And this is part of it is about female vampiress, who was a daughter of Lucas Notaras.
Wait, which one? Which daughter?
Oh, I don't know. And I don't think that the author knew. It didn't matter. But no, this was the one that wasn't sent to Venice.
Right.
But she stayed in Constantinople. She stayed behind and she was turned into a vampire. During the fall. And what is absolutely fascinating, and this is also very typical, very characteristic of how these narratives are constructed, this part is not based on any Byzantine sources. Yeah, I know that no Byzantine sources say that Notara's daughter was a vampire, but it's based on the book by Valtari, Dark Angel. This was a very, in Poland, it was an extremely famous book. It's a Finnish author. It was translated into German and I think into English as well. And she plays with this book because the author quite rightly assumes that people would know this. This was a very famous book about the fall of Constantinople, once again, one of those two topics. So, and I like the book. This is very, very nice. Of course, this is only partly Byzantine because then it's set in modern times. There is, of course, this book that I mentioned in my chapter. The title is Sultan Vampire and the Soothsayer, and this sort of implies that Vlad the Impaler is some supernatural creature. they don't say explicitly he's a vampire, but well, something's wrong with him. And then, the book, because there are zombies, right? So we have zombies of Byzantium. I think it's a very entertaining book. I mean, there's one mistake after another, but that doesn't really matter. I'm not reading these books to find mistakes. But I think I found it very entertaining. I liked it a lot. And there is one more book that I found like a couple days ago. So I haven't read it yet. It's on its way to me. And it's called The Demons of Constantinople. As far as I understood from the synopsis, it's about demons that live in modern technology and they travel back to Constantinople. I don't understand, but it sounded so crazy that I decided I have to read it. So I think this is some sort of self-published book. Well, I'm very much looking forward to reading this.
So of the books that you mentioned, I've read Zombies in Byzantium or Zombies of Byzantium. It's a very short book. Yeah. And it's a zombie outbreak in the reign of Leo the Third, I believe.
I think so. Yeah.
I haven't read any of the vampiric ones. But you know what? Actually, one of my regrets is that many years ago, could it be 30 years ago, I came across a book randomly in a bookstore, because bookstores existed then, and it was called The Cappadocian. And at the time, I was working on Procopius, and I thought, this is interesting. But it was a little paperback novel, and it clearly wasn't John the Cappadocian. I don't know what this Cappadocian was. So I picked it up and I looked at it. And here's the story that apparently it told. That Constantinople had always been a den of vampires who had lived underground for centuries and centuries and centuries, until the Fourth Crusade sacked the city and somehow released all of these vampires, and they flee out of Constantinople, and suddenly the world has this vampiric infestation.
I saw the book on Amazon the other day. So I think it's one of the series. I mean, there's entire. I mean, it's not probably about Byzantium, but yeah, it's fascinating. I mean,
but I didn't buy it, and then I was unable to find a book called The Cappadocian because that search term just turned up everything else. Anyway. So how about if we talk about a few specific categories of fiction, and maybe you can tell us a couple of examples of each one. I have a couple of my favorites. Let's start with Byzantium and alternative history. Can you tell us a little bit about what this genre is and some books in it that you would recommend?
Alternative history, or this is Althis, as it is also called, is when you sort of change the reality and you have some sort of different outcome of a major or minor, can be as well, event, right? So something happened differently than really happened in history. But I mean, I always say that the first one was Tyrone Leblanc, so this 15th century Catalan novel where Tyrone Leblanc, so the white tyrant of, I think that would be this. He travels to Constantinople and helps defeat the Turks. The empire didn't fall, and so on and so on. This was written a couple of years after the fall of Constantinople in the 15th century. So, but it checks the boxes. It is an alternative history. But actually, the first alt-hist novel that I'm aware of, which is partly Byzantine, is the Lest Darkness Fall by Sprague Le Camp, if this is how his name is pronounced. It's not like 100% Byzantine, but this is about the archaeologist that travels back to Italy, to Gothic kingdom, and then he rescues this kingdom. He even convinces Belisarius to join him, and Belisarius helps defeat Byzantium. And then, as far as I remember, and then there won't be dark ages, hence the title, Lest the Darkness Fall. This was published in 1941, so it's quite old, but it had some sequels, including quite recent in 2011. I mean, of course, they were written by different authors. And one of the authors who was invited to write the sequel was Harry Turtleduff.
Right.
And he wrote a short novel or short story about how this archaeologist, whose name I forgot, helped stop Justinian's plague. I mean, so the plague doesn't happen because he helps to stop it. So that would be the first one. And of course, the master of this is Harry Turtledove, that you surely know
Yes.
him. He's a professionally trained historian,
Yes.
Byzantinist, and he wrote this fascinating book, Agent of Byzantium. So this is Byzantium where Islam doesn't exist. And I think that Muhammad is just one of Byzantine saints. So this is really, I mean, this is fun. I really like alternative history. So it's very, very interesting. There's a Polish one, which I would say it's partly also alternative history, but it's absolutely crazy. It's about Poland, which is attacked by the forces of the Eternal Byzantium. They just appear. That's just appear at some point in Warsaw. They conquer Poland, and Poland becomes part of the Byzantine Empire. Ostrogorski's history is banished. People cannot read it because they would be able to understand how the Byzantines operate. And I think it's hilarious. I mean, it's not a very good book, but I found it absolutely fantastic. So we have in Katowice, so where my university is, we have a huge building which is called a saucer because it looks like a flying saucer.
Yeah.
So the Byzantines destroyed it completely, and they built the Palace of the Logotet instead to rule Poland from this place. I really like the book, and it's really funny. I think it should be translated into English, well, at least just for fun. I've heard, and this is actually, well, sort of what I was talking before, that there is a huge market for such books in Russia. If that's true or not, I have no idea.
Right.
So the books that narrate the story of the world when Byzantium still exists. But whether it is true or not, I have no idea, and I have no means to check it. But, well, might be. Why not?
Thank you for mentioning Harry Turtledove. I was actually in correspondence with him about 10 years ago, and I've tried to get him on the podcast, but he's not responding to email lately. And I mean, he must be very old by now, but you're exactly right. He was trained as a Byzantinist. He actually had produced the first English partial translation of Theophanes the Confessor. He continues to write. He's like the king of alternative history, and not just about Byzantium. He's written all kinds of things. So I'm still holding out that maybe I'll be able to get him on the podcast.
I mean, we were in touch some time ago, but when we were about to publish the book, and I asked him if he could write something for the book, but as he's a acclaimed author, there was fee involved, and of course we couldn't afford it. So yeah,
right.
Well, it was some time ago, perhaps, and I think that he told me that he was ill at the time, so perhaps it's even worse now.
Yeah, I'd like to mention a series that isn't about Byzantium as such. It's called Romanitas by Sophia McDougall, and it's an alternative history in which the Roman Empire never falls and continues to expand. I think that the split-off point is the reign of Pertinax in the late 2nd century, and it establishes a kind of global empire in competition with the Japanese, or kind of like Man in the High Tower, but using Rome, not the sort of Nazis and so forth. And it's set in modern times, and it's very well written literature. Though of course everyone in it is depressed and sad all the time. But it's a very interesting representation of what the Roman Empire would have been had it continued along, paths of expansion and technological, experiments and so forth. Anyway, I don't see that book, mentioned or cited very often, and I wanted to plug it here. There's actually 3 in the series. The first 2 are pretty good. And one of the characters does live in Byzantium for a while, but it's just a little city off in the Bosporus. And
but that there are websites of fora when people discuss Byzantium. For instance, I remember that I checked one of those like a couple years ago, and at that time the Albanian Labour Party was ruling Byzantium. It was really hilarious. I mean, people are doing these things, and I find it extremely interesting. I mean, this was really, really good. I can't remember who the emperor was.
A lot of alternative history scenarios are now generated through like medieval video games, where sort of competitive strategy video games, where you can take on a particular state or dynasty or whatever, and history carries on very differently than the point from which you start the story, and you can end up with scenarios just like these, I'm told, in the video game. I don't play them, but I can see a scenario where the Albanian, Workers' Party. Why not? Okay, let's turn to Byzantium and fantasy fiction.
Because if you think fantasy, then you think Tolkien, right?
Yes.
Because I know that Tolkien, at least once in one of his letters, he says something that Gondor at some point resembles increasingly impotent Byzantium.
Yes.
Are his words.
Yes.
But then I stumbled upon like huge discussions of Tolkien fans saying, no, no, it's not true. He doesn't really compare it to Byzantium, blah, blah, blah. I don't really understand these discussions, but I think that as a historian, he probably saw this. I mean, I understand the parallel that Gondor is first a powerful medieval kingdom and then it is not. I would say that at least there's a hint of Byzantium in Tolkien. But actually, I would say that there's even more. And once again, people discussing this on the internet are pointing this out as well. There's more Byzantium in Game of Thrones.
Yes, say more.
I think that there's even some sort of big chain that is, right, like the chain in Constantinople.
Oh, right, yes.
Yeah, and they say that Westeros, okay, I'm not a fan of the book, but people saying that Westeros, so I think this is one of the kingdoms, resemble Byzantium. So
yeah, in some ways, you mean King's Landing, the chain that's blocking the harbor?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I had forgotten that. So can I make a case for Tolkien being more Byzantine oriented than perhaps these online fora might suggest? He knew languages as a kind of medievalist, and he modeled the Black speech of Mordor, the speech of the orcs or whatever, on Turkish. Right? And the whole idea of the Orcish siege of Minas Tirith was the siege of Constantinople. And in fact, Mordor, that's right next to Minas Tirith, looks like the outline of Turkey. It does. And now here's the interesting thing. The siege of Minas Tirith and the battle that takes place that saves the city at the end is a mashup of the siege of Constantinople by the Turks on the one hand, and the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, where a Roman Gothic alliance defeats Attila, whom, Tolkien, living when he did, would also have considered, part of the sort of broader Turkish nomadics, kind of steppe kind of peoples. And the idea there is that this decadent old empire that's modeled on Constantinople is being attacked by these sort of Turkish-speaking orcs. And who comes to the rescue but these Germanic-speaking, fresh Germanic blood people who rejuvenate Europe, like that narrative. I put that together from some of his letters where he makes references to these things. I was interested to see that in the movie versions of The Lord of the Rings, they did give Gondor a kind of quasi-Byzantine architectural aesthetic with the, like Ravenna style more than Constantinople, I thought. But anyway.
Maybe. Well, Crusades is also one of the themes that are, I wouldn't say beloved, but very popular. Well, yeah, makes sense. I'm not sure. I'm not really a huge fan of Tolkien. I had friends who were disguised like hobbits and going, climbing mountains, discussing the language. But okay, so that's not my thing. But that sounds very probable. Why not?
Okay, what about Byzantium and social science fiction? And can you tell us a little bit what that is?
Social science fiction is science fiction that is like a commentary on politics or social society or something like this. This was very popular in Poland in the 80s of the 20th century when you couldn't outright criticize communism. Right. So you could use it, so you could say various things, disguising them as sci-fi. I would say that the only book that I would think sort of qualifies is the one that I mentioned about Byzantium conquering Poland. It's called Army of the Blind People, which I think is reference to the blind, to blind being the Bulgarian army by Basil the Bulgar Slayer. but I'm not terribly sure what the author really wanted to criticize or comment upon, because it's slightly, I mean, it's not communism in Poland anymore. So some sort of, I don't know, societal thing, I don't know. But I would say that this is the only thing that comes to my mind. But once again, I wouldn't even dare to say that I know a small fraction of books on Byzantium. So perhaps there exists such a text written in, I don't know, Ukrainian, Russian, Bulgarian.
Sure. So now, not alternative history, but like parallel universes or alternative realities. So this isn't like where there's a historical timeline that we recognize that then diverges, but just a completely different part of the multiverse, let's say. What kinds of Byzantiums appear there?
Probably the most famous one, I don't want to say the only one, but probably the most famous one is this 2-volume novel called Sarantine Mosaic. So, it's not even trying to disguise the Sarantine, Byzantine.
Right.
But it's very clear that this is a parallel universe because they have two suns orbiting Earth. So it's clearly said that this is not our universe. But of course, once again, this is mostly a play on Procopius' secret history.
Again.
I mean, you don't have to know this to enjoy the book, because it's fun anyway. But if you know Procopius' secret history, then you can read it like a sort of play with his text. This is like the alternative reality Byzantium. But of course, you may say that every single novel that adds some sort of element that doesn't really exist in our reality is parallel universe. So the zombies of Byzantium would be a parallel universe, because as far as I remember, there were no zombies involved in the siege of Constantinople. Yes. So in a way, all of these novels are to some extent alternative reality stories.
What does the author of Sarantine Mosaic, what does he gain exactly by creating an alternative quasi-Byzantium? Why not just set it directly in the historical one?
But I'm not sure if I can answer. I know that there is a very scholarly article written on this. You have a world and you can play with the world without constraints of our reality. That's what I would say is probably the most important. For me, it was fun to observe how he reuses Procopius and how he plays with this narrative. There are, crazy, holy men who are really crazy. I'm not sure if this is like a sort of commentary or anything, but I think that you may do whatever you want, right? Yeah. And then there's also a joy in these two layers, so to speak. You can read it as a story, and you can read it as a story which uses a different story to create itself, right. Which is fantastic as well. I forgot completely the name of the title of the text, but there is a text that very thoroughly analyzes Sarantine Mosaic, right, from a non-Byzantine point of view.
Okay, no, I'll look into it. But because sometimes an author might be making a sort of very deep point in some way by doing that, or it just might be, well, the balance slightly shifted because I want to have some imaginative elements. I want to deviate from history, have some things that aren't exactly that follow the sources, and I maybe don't want to do all the research to like get it right for every character, and so it kind of tips in that direction. I'll just make up my own Byzantium.
But isn't that a very Byzantine thing? You take a famous text and then you turn it into your
yes, absolutely. Yes,
like I would say that's very Byzantine.
Procopius himself is doing that.
Yeah.
He's modeling, stories told about ancient disreputable women and using them as templates to construct his own version of Theodora. I mean, all right. Let's turn to Byzantium in detective fiction. There's some good books here.
Yeah, one thing that I have to say at the beginning, I'm not really a fan of detective stories. My grandma was. She had like hundreds upon hundreds of detective stories, and I hate them because I always want to know who did it. This is very interesting because we have No, well, we have Panayotis Agapitos' books, which are not translated into English, as far as I remember.
Yeah, that's right. I think so.
There are translations into French and Czech as well by Markéta Kulhánková. So this is what I would call the Professoren-Roman. Yeah? So he really uses his knowledge, and I know that he's a huge fan of detective stories as well.
Yes.
So these are very interesting. Then you have, I haven't read all of them, but there's 12 volumes, and the last one appeared in 2018. And this is John the Eunuch Tauris.
That has 12 volumes?
12, that has 12 volumes. Yeah,
I had left them, I had read like 3 or something. Wow.
2018 was the last one.
Have you read any of them?
Nah, I tried the first one, but it was, I'm trying to be positive, so it wasn't terribly interesting.
Oh, yeah. So I was reading them. I think they were at the time at least sort of self-published, maybe not even easy to get. I was reading them because they were set in the 6th century, again using Procopius, and I was working on Procopius at the time. And they were not great literature. I don't even know how I made it to like 3. I think it was just sort of professional diligence. But yeah, so it's a eunuch at the court of Justinian, like one of his secretaries, something, who's solving mysteries in Constantinople for various. Yeah. And you mentioned Agapitos. I read, there were 3. I read all 3. The first one is really good. The Eveni nor Lauto, and it's a detective story in the 9th century. I think Photius is distantly involved in some. Anyway, it was very well written. I enjoyed that very much. Also, there was a Harper's Mosaic of Shadows, I remember, which is also a Varangian story.
Actually, I have to say that I can't remember what the mystery was, but what I remember was the female doctor that was based on Nana Komneni.
Right.
I mean, it was clearly this kind of inspiration.
Yes. The story, I think, and I read this 20 years ago, was something about, so the first crusade is approaching Constantinople, or is there, or whatever, and someone is going around Constantinople with a crossbow murdering people, and it has a sort of political angle, and someone at the court asks our character to investigate and find what's going on. I had corresponded with the author, Tom Harper, I think, just out of curiosity, and he went on to produce some sequels. The thing is that the sequels then took a hard crusading turn.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he told me that his editors said, nah, from now on it's got to be Crusades because that's where the audience is.
But funnily enough, it's exactly the same story with this vampiress that I mentioned. The first book is Byzantine, but the next one is Crusades.
Right.
So, because it's, I think, more appealing for the audience and better known simply. There's one more book which is called The Eunuch's Secret, a Byzantine murder mystery.
Oh.
And the guy has clearly did his homework. There's even an image from Scalicis Madridensis on the cover.
Mm.
I read like half of it and I'm still trying to finish. But what I found very interesting is that he tries to be so Byzantine. So you have image from the manuscript. He really read his sources, and then every single person, every single character in the book has a name which is a Latin version of the Greek one.
Oh, that.
I mean, I can't understand this, and it's really off-putting. I mean, I couldn't really. This was.
All right. What about Byzantium in space? Are there galactic empires that look like Byzantium?
The first thing that, if you say Byzantium in space, then I immediately think about pigs in space. But it's, of course, Arkady Martin's novels, right? So yes. She's a scholar. I think she worked on Armenia, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, 11th century sort of Constantinople-Armenia relations. Yeah.
This is based on her work. And these were extremely successful because I think that the first one got Hugo Award, if I'm not mistaken, and the second one as well, or at least it was nominated. I remember vaguely that Niki Kutraku, she wrote many years ago a paper on Byzantium in literature. This was published in this Italian sort of handbook, the Byzantium Spazio, I think this was. I can't remember really, but she also mentioned that this idea of Byzantium appears in novels from the Star Trek universum. I'm not sure to what extent. I mean, I've never really had the time to follow this, but this is what she says. I think that she says that whenever some very intricate plans are mentioned, they're always Byzantine.
Okay.
At least that's what I remember. As I say, it was a long time ago. But I don't think there's more. There is at least one episode of Star Trek, original one, when they travel to a planet and then the entire architecture is modeled on Constantinople. I have to check this, but there's at least one episode which is very, very Byzantine. It's not really literature, but still interesting.
I would also strongly recommend Arkady Martin's I've only read the first book. Actually, it's called Memory Called Empire, and it's well done. It's very well written too. They're far more about like Romans in space. That's Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie is one of those, and Baxter's Ultima have either actual Romans in space or quasi-Roman civilizations. But see, the court at Constantinople offers such opportunity for wearing costumes and getup, which yes. I'm sure that the actors, especially in the 60s, really, really wanted to do. And so there might be some more hints there that, are allusions that we're not catching.
I did check, and it's called Requiem for Methuselah, and it was aired on February 14th, 1969.
Right.
It was amazing. And I think that they have even the outfit. Yep, the outfit of the main character on the planet is clearly modeled on the mosaics from Ravenna.
Nice. Any final thoughts for our audience about this whole sort of, Byzantium and speculative fiction topic?
Yeah, I wanted to say two things. Actually, I should have started with this because, well, this day, the fall of Constantinople and stuff. And have you seen Netflix Three Body Problem?
Yes.
Okay, so this is just the first volume, right? Because there are three of them, and they are also translated into Polish, as I was told, very poorly. And I think not really from Chinese, but from English. Anyway, the third volume opens with a scene which is set during the fall of Constantinople.
Okay.
It's really fantastic. So there's this lady who has this ability that she can, I think that I can't remember whether she can teleport everywhere or she can teleport things. So she kills somebody using these abilities. Right. Then, of course, Constantine is very happy because he thinks that they will win. And then she loses the abilities and he's not very happy. I'm not really sure because, this book is really complicated. So I'm not sure how this really connects with the other, but I really laughed that, that the Chinese author thought that this was that important, right? So this was really interesting. It's like this. I remember I once read a Japanese novel, which was about the fall of Constantinople, and I find it fascinating that people from other cultures still think that this was that important. But actually, can we at the end? Can I ask you a question?
Of course.
I know that we kept using Byzantium, and I know that you're not a fan. Do you think that actually these novels reinforce the idea of Byzantium? Because I know that in your forthcoming book, you argue for renaming or reframing the discipline from Byzantium to Eastern Roman studies, right?
Yes.
But do you think that these novels actually perpetuate this, that they make it more popular, or it would be difficult to change it because people are so used? I'm not talking about scholars. I'm talking about general readership.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've thought about it, and I don't think there's a straightforward answer to this. So first of all, the authors are writing about what they think is Byzantium, and many of these are operating within the world of sort of stereotypes that are associated with Byzantium, as you explained at the beginning. And so I have no problem calling what they're engaging with Byzantium. They're engaging less with the historical society that I study through its sources and more with the imaginary of it that, circulates in European memory. So it is Byzantium what they're dealing with. They're not dealing with the East Roman polity or anything like that. For the most part, there might be some exceptions. On the question of how we sort of negotiate this tension between popular perceptions and scholarly practice, I would say that since I am like almost 100% on the side of scholarly practice as in what I do and how I think and the interests that I represent, my loyalties are to history and our discipline, and not so much to popular perceptions. And I think that if scholars change our terms and our understanding of this society, which I think is happening, in time, that will also follow in popular culture. Or this thing called Byzantium will become detached as a kind of free-floating, cultural signifier that can be used to market products. And I don't mean that in a dismissive way, but Byzantium is also used to market clothing and aromas and like all kinds of things.
Ice cream in Poland, right?
Okay, why not? Byzantine ice cream, okay. And so either of those scenarios is fine with me. I'm primarily interested in how we represent the society as scholars. And I think that we're doing it a disservice by creating this, it's not a back door, it's the front gate, where all of that popular misperception just comes right into our field. And I see it again and again and again about how historians sometimes model history based on these kinds of stereotypes. And that's what I'm trying to fix. I don't have a real opinion as to how those stereotypes should or can operate independently in fiction or the world of, capitalist marketing or whatever. It's not an easy question to answer, and so I appreciate your asking it. I like these challenging questions. I think one at a time, maybe. What do you have? What's your take on this?
Because I have recently finished writing a chapter on Byzantium in literature, and I found a review that Krumbacher wrote about a popular book. I think it was Iran and the Eunuchs. And he says something extremely interesting. He says, and suddenly Byzantium became so popular. Should we be happy about this? And then, of course, he goes on. I mean, he didn't like the book. That's obvious.
Right.
But he says also something extremely important. He says, it's not because it's not historically accurate. And I think this is important. I like all those books, and I really don't care whether they are accurate or inaccurate. Right. That doesn't make sense. I read them for pleasure, not for listing the errors. But he says that he doesn't like the book because it perpetuates the harmful stereotypes it brings.
Wait, hold on. Krumbacher himself endorses all of those stereotypes in the introductions to his books.
Yeah, right. But that's him, and that's, I think it's a different stereotypes that he wrote this after he says at the beginning of the interview that this was written after he saw the pantomime, L'Impératrice, in some sort of variety show. And he says that at the end of the show, the clothing that the lady had on herself was so thin that even his friend Rentgen would be jealous. I think these are slightly different sort of stereotypes, that he perpetuates, I think.
Yeah, it's possible that he was more sort of offended by sort of vulgarity or salacious, titillation and
Yeah.
As a high-minded European intellectual of the late 19th century,
probably.
Yeah, but his description of the parameters of Byzantine culture and its values in the introductions to his books is just straight up stereotyping in my view, and not the good kind. So
Yeah, but on the other hand, if I may say, I mean, I did say this repeatedly in various texts, but I really like this. Charles Dill said at some point that he actually knows that Sarah Bernard, Victorien Sardou, and I forgot the name, but the author of of one of the operas, they did more for Byzantium than the scholars. And I think that he's right. I mean, I'm absolutely sure that people that heard about Byzantium, they know more in Poland. They know more about Byzantium from these popular books than, I don't know, from the stuff we're writing. And I think it's important. I still find it important because I usually think that this is why, perhaps to say this at the end, this is why I think those books are important, because somebody reads it, somebody thinks, well, this is interesting, and then tries to learn more.
Right. Oh, I am not denying that at all. In our age, that possibly happens with video games.
Right.
When I ask students, why are you taking this course? Some of them will say, well, I played Assassin's Creed and it looked cool and I wanted to.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. But at the same time, the productions that you're referring to in the late 19th century were spectacular, like mega productions that were seen by many thousands of people and sort of elite society and so forth. We don't have anything comparable to that. If for example, we had a Byzantine equivalent of Game of Thrones that had that kind of comparable impact, we'd be in a different position as a field, even if that show reproduced many of those stereotypes. But I don't think that we do. Our field, our civilization is not represented on that scale anymore, as it used to in the late 19th century, because that was a period of kind of anti-rationalism, sort of romanticism. Orientalism was a positive thing. Deal talks about Orientalism as what makes Byzantium interesting and fascinating and cool to study, right? And today we think of it as, it's all racism and whatever.
Yeah.
So it was a different era. If someone were to come along and change the whole terrain of popular culture that way, yeah, all right, well, we'd be having a different discussion.
Anyway, I think that I really recommend reading this text. Actually, you say that you were in touch with the author of the Mosaic of Shadows. Yes. And I know that many of the authors are actually in touch with Byzantinists. And they ask things like there's a Polish novel, Black Icon, full of demons. This actually Manzika, this is Byzantines won and everything's fine. So empire has no problems. He modeled like almost every description of demons and such things on Mango's book on Byzantium. I mean, it was fantastic. I was reading, the text, the novel next to the Mango description, and I said, God, this is actually the same. Just he's made it slightly more flowery, so to speak. But this was fascinating. So they use what we produce, and I find it. I don't want to say parasitic because that's a bad thing. I mean, this is
synergistic.
Exactly, synergetic. I think extremely interesting.
Oh yes. So I am in contact with about half a dozen people who are writing Byzantine-themed novels, and every once in a while, every few months, we have a Zoom call, and they ask me all their questions about what did women wear in public? How do you lock a door? Things like this. And I do my best. As far as I know, these are all straight historical novels. They don't have any of this kind of speculative or sci-fi. And we'll see, what they look like when or if they come out. But I consider that part of my service. Yeah, as an expert, and they can write whatever stories they want, but if they ask me for the history, I do my best.
That's great. Yeah, that's great.
Przemek, actually, you sound like you should be doing your own podcast about these things. Those are good questions, and so thank you for those.
Well, I think that I will stick to to podcasts that are already well established.
Got it. Okay, but I'll be looking for your next publications. Maybe we can do this about a different type of material. Przemek, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
This was a great
This
pleasure.
was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Take care.